All right, let's talk about deterrence and the death penalty. So let's start with some assumptions of deterrence policy. So first of all, let's remember that punishment is when the state deprives a person of life or liberty. And we need to justify this ethically. Now, the primary function of punishment is deterrence. Right? This is the idea that the threat of some type of punishment is assumed to prevent people from committing crimes. Some feel as though the death penalty can only be ethically justified if we can conclusively prove that taking the life of convicted killers saves the lives of innocent victims by preventing others who are aware of the death penalty from committing murder. This is a consequentialist approach. And so for those of you that have taken CJ Ethics, remember the consequentialists want to see a positive outcome. Now Kant, who is not a consequentialist, says the death penalty is morally demanded in the name of justice. So those who have faith in deterrence generally favor rational choice theory. This assumes that our behavior is governed by consequences, and if the net effect of that behavior is rewarding, then that behavior is reinforced and we repeat it. If the net effect of our behavior is negative, the behavior is punished and will be avoided. Now, punishment only deters crime if it exceeds the gains. Now, gains can be material, actual physical things that you gained from something. They could be psychological, or they could have both material and psychological benefits. Deterrence theorists assume that offenders are rational and have free will, but we know that not all offenders are rational, and most offenders fail to fully understand and appreciate long-term consequences of their behavior. Most people tend to focus on the short-term consequences. Deterrence scholars recognize that personal factors and background factors place us at different risks to offend. Personal factors include our temperament, intelligence, cognitive style, strength of conscience, and our background is our family structure, class, and neighborhood. But deterrence theorists largely ignore these factors and instead focus on the probability of apprehension and severity of punishment. Now, our rationality is constrained by ability, knowledge, emotional input, and time. And more often, most people are ignorant of the full range of consequences of their behavior, or they discount them. Recall that specific deterrence is the effect of a punishment on the future behavior of that person. Whoa, holy typos. Specific deterrence doesn't seem to work very well. When we look at parolees, recidivism at the third year is 67%. So 2/3 of people within 3 years of release have recidivated. So people who break the law consistently discount the risk of punishment. The effect of punishment on future behavior depends heavily on the contrast effect, the distinction between the conditions of the threatened punishment and the conditions of the everyday lives of people being punished. So the people for whom specific deterrence works the best are the people who need it the least. Now, we know that in order for punishment to work, and specifically for it to deter, it needs to be swift, certain, and severe. Certain, there has to be a high degree of certainty that we will actually be punished. Swift means as soon as possible, and severity doesn't actually mean a severe punishment, but it means that the punishment is sufficiently severe to exceed any gains. But the justice system moves very slowly, especially for murder cases. So in the 50s, it was an average of about 14 months between conviction and execution. In 2000, it was about 10 years. And by 2012, it is 14.5 years. In California, the average waiting time is 25 years. So clearly, this is not swift punishment. Research does show that there's a substantial negative correlation. So remember, negative correlation means as one thing goes up, the other thing goes down, between the likelihood of conviction and crime rates. Now, there's a much weaker negative correlation for severity of punishment. When we increase the number of people being incarcerated, that accounts for about 20 and 30% of the decline in violent crime over the past decade. But we don't know, is this incapacitation or is this deterrence? So the death penalty is the only punishment that is required to demonstrate its deterrent effect in order to validate it being constitutional. Now, obviously, if we execute a murderer, they cannot harm anyone else. Okay, that, however, is incapacitation. What we want to know is, does the presence of the death penalty deter some unknown number of people from committing murder? We also want to remember that this only applies to the type of heinous murders for which the death penalty is an option, and less than 1% of those given a death sentence. This is less than 1% of those given a death sentence to Less than 1% of the people who got a death sentence since 1977 have actually been executed. So early studies tried to examine this by comparing homicide rates in states with or without the death penalty, or homicide rates pre and post abolition. But this is very simplistic, and it doesn't control for other factors that play a role, like demographics, social and economic factors, and how certain it is that one will receive the death penalty. So here you can see the comparison of murder rates in death penalty states, which is the dark red, and the pinkish color is non-death penalty states. And you can see them side by side compared over the years. And then we have another comparison here. So one factor that played a role in the Gregg decision was a study by economist Isaac Ehrlich in 1975. And he used more sophisticated techniques than earlier studies, including a measure for certainty of the death penalty. And he found that each execution may have prevented 7 or 8 murders. Now in 1980, Bailey also used sophisticated techniques and found that there is no deterrent effect. Now, a couple things to remember. Criminal justice data is very flawed. It's incomplete. It's often ambiguous. We also want to think about, is our ideology and our theoretical assumptions influencing how we conceive and conduct research? So what gets compared here a lot is research by economists and research by criminologists. There is no consistent, reliable statistical evidence that the death penalty deters potential offenders. One thing we want to think about, though, is does it have a brutalizing effect? Some would argue that the presence of executions is giving a message that it's all right to kill people who offended us. So it might serve to legitimize the notion of revenge. When capital punishment in Oklahoma was followed by an increase in stranger killings. It was an increase of 1 stranger homicide per month in a year following the execution. Now, if brutalization effects are true, it would be most evident in a nation like Saudi Arabia, which hands out brutal punishments. But Saudi Arabia has a relatively low level of violent crime. Most anti-death penalty criminologists either disagreed or strongly disagreed that the death penalty has a brutalizing effect. Now, if capital punishment were applied to crimes like rape, robbery, or kidnapping, that could incentivize offenders to kill their victims to reduce the chance of being caught. And that is one of the reasons why we don't allow the death penalty for crimes that fall short of murder. Now, Shepard, who's an economist and a law professor, found evidence for both deterrence and brutalizing effects. And he looked at 3,054 counties in states with capital punishment from 1977 to 1996. And he found that there's a threshold effect. So states with a deterrent effect had an average of 32 executions over the time period. States that had neither a brutalizing nor a deterrent effect had an average of 6.7 executions, and states with a brutalizing effect had an average of 8.6 executions. So when executions are rare, they may have a brutalizing effect. When they're relatively common, they may have a deterrent effect. So the Committee on Deterrence and the Death Penalty was composed of 9 highly respected death penalty scholars and convened by the National Academy of Science Subcommittee. And they said that deterrence studies should not be used to influence judicial deliberations. Now, 2 Dutch statisticians came to similar conclusions. They showed it was pretty easy to derive contradictory results by employing alternative specifications. Essentially, our evidence is still too fragile to use it to make these life or death decisions. So what do we need to show? What needs to happen in order for us to demonstrate the death penalty as a deterrent? The only way to truly test this would be randomized experiments. This, however, is highly unethical. We'd have to randomly assign states to a death penalty in a control group, randomly assign people to live in one state or the other, make sure everyone given a death sentence is executed within, say, 2 years, Run this for 10 years and then compare the murder rates. Obviously, huge ethical implications here. But as we develop more sophisticated statistical techniques, we may get better answers. It may also be good for economists and criminologists to work together. Now, in 1989, the ASC issued a resolution on the death penalty, and they found that social science has found the death penalty to be racist in application, that there's no evidence of criminal deterrence, and that the public generally condemns this form of punishment. So they urge their members to use their professional skills to seek speedy abolition of this form of punishment. Now, the American Society of Criminology is the preeminent professional organization in this field. They have a national conference every year. This is where the students that have been on the research team have gone to present their research. Now, 88% of eminent ASC members agreed or strongly agreed that the death penalty was not a deterrent. Now, Cooper, Walsh, and Willis found that 68% of criminologists described themselves as either liberal or radical, and that abolition of capital punishment falls within that liberal side of the political divide. Compare this with 500 chiefs of police, where 37% consider the death penalty to reduce homicides, compared to 5% of criminologists. Remember, though, criminologists are doing this from a perspective of having some research and data to back it up, whereas chiefs of police are doing this anecdotally. So there's this thing called Pascal's wager, and it's the, quote, best bet argument. Pascal is a 17th century mathematician, physicist, and philosopher, and he admitted to the uncertainty of God's existence. But he said, in the face of uncertainty, the best bet is to wager that he does exist and to live your life accordingly. Now, Pascal's argument applies only in conditions of uncertainty where it's sort of 50-50. So death penalty proponents applying Pascal's reasoning said that rational people will consider the death penalty the best benefit. If the death penalty deters some unknown number of murderers and we choose to use it, we have saved innocent lives. But if the death penalty deters and we choose not to use it, we are in some sense a party to those lost innocent lives. And that wraps up this lecture on deterrence.